The morning of December 7th, 1941, began like any other peaceful Sunday at Pearl Harbor. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona stretched and yawned as the Hawaiian sun cast its golden rays across the tranquil waters of the naval base. Most were planning lazy afternoons, perhaps a game of baseball on the shore or letters home to sweethearts and families. The massive battleships sat like sleeping giants in the harbor, their steel hulls gleaming in the tropical light. Captain Franklin von Valkenburg stood on the bridge of the Arizona, sipping his morning coffee and reviewing routine reports. The 47-year-old naval officer had commanded the battleship for nearly 2 years, and Sunday mornings were typically his favorite time of the week. The crew was relaxed, the pace unhurried, and the beauty of the Hawaiian landscape never failed to remind him why he had chosen a life at sea. Below deck, Seaman First Class James Ward was writing a letter to his mother in Ohio. The 19-year-old had enlisted just 8 months earlier, drawn by the promise of adventure and the steady pay that would help support his family back home. His pen moved slowly across the paper as he described the paradise he had found in Hawaii. The warm weather, the friendly locals, and the camaraderie among his shipmates. At nearby Hickam Field, Army Air Corps mechanics were performing routine maintenance on the rows of aircraft lined up on the tarmac. The sight of so many planes parked so closely together would later prove catastrophic. But on this peaceful morning, it seemed perfectly logical. Space was limited, and the aircraft were easier to service when grouped together. Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen, commander of the 18th Pursuit Group, was reviewing flight schedules in his office when he noticed something unusual on the horizon. Small black dots were approaching from the north, growing larger by the minute. His first thought was that it might be a training exercise he had forgotten about. But something about the formation seemed wrong. These weren't American aircraft. Patterns. The tranquility was shattered at 7:48 a.m. when the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed over the harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the attack force, gave the signal that would echo through history. Tora, Tora, Tora. The code words confirmed that complete surprise had been achieved. Bombs began falling like deadly rain across the naval base. The USS Oklahoma was among the first to be hit, taking multiple torpedo strikes that caused the massive battleship to begin listing heavily to port. Sailors scrambled across tilting decks, many still in their pajamas, trying to reach their battle stations as the ship groaned and shuddered under the devastating assault on Ford Island. Aviation machinist's mate John Finn was getting ready for church when he heard the explosions. Looking out his window, he saw Japanese planes with the distinctive rising sun markings on their wings, diving toward the harbor without hesitation. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the Naval Air Station, knowing that every second counted. In what was clearly a coordinated attack on American forces, the surprise was complete, the damage immediate and catastrophic. As the first wave of Japanese bombers and fighters swept across Pearl Harbor, they found their targets defenseless and unprepared. The peaceful Sunday morning had transformed into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and twisted metal that would change the course of American history forever. The USS Arizona bore the brunt of the Japanese assault with a courage that would become legendary. As bombs screamed down from the sky, Captain von Valkenburg refused to abandon his post on the bridge, shouting orders to his crew even as explosions rocked the massive battleship. His voice carried across the chaos, calm and authoritative, as he directed damage control efforts and tried to organize a defense against the overwhelming attack. Seaman Ward had dropped his letter home and was racing toward his battle station when the first bomb struck the Arizona's forward magazine. The explosion was unlike anything the young sailor had ever experienced. The deck beneath his feet buckled and heaved, and the acrid smell of smoke and curdite filled the air. Through the confusion, he could hear officers shouting orders and the screams of wounded men echoing across the harbor dot at 8:06 a.m. A Japanese bomber scored a direct hit on the Arizona's forward ammunition storage area. The resulting explosion was so massive that it lifted the entire bow section of the battleship out of the water before slamming it back down in a twisted wreck of steel and fire. The blast could be heard for miles, and the fireball that erupted From the ship rose hundreds of feet into the Hawaiian sky. According to historical records maintained by the National Archives, the explosion aboard the USS Arizona was so powerful that it registered on seismographs in Honolulu. Captain Van Valkenburg and most of his senior officers were killed instantly in the blast, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. Even as the Arizona settled into the harbor bottom, survivors continued to fight back against the Japanese attackers. Gunner's mate Third Class Paul Goodyear managed to reach one of the ship's anti-aircraft guns and began firing at the low-flying enemy aircraft, his shots joining a growing chorus of American resistance. The scene aboard the sinking battleship was both horrifying and heroic. Sailors pulled their wounded comrades from twisted wreckage, often at great risk to their own lives. Hospital Corpsman Third Class Joe George organized rescue efforts in the ship's medical bay, treating burns and injuries even as water began flooding the lower decks. His calm professionalism in the face of chaos saved dozens of lives. On the Arizona's stern, which remained above water, Ensign Douglas Hine rallied a group of surviving sailors to continue the fight. Despite being wounded himself, the young officer helped establish a makeshift command post and coordinated rescue efforts for men trapped in the flooded sections of the ship. His leadership under fire exemplified the courage that would define the American response to the Pearl Harbor attack. The water around the Arizona became a hellish scene of burning oil and desperate swimmers. Seaman Ward, having survived the initial explosion, found himself in the harbor trying to reach shore. The water was black with oil and debris, and the heat from the burning ship was almost unbearable. Other sailors were swimming alongside him, some badly injured, all determined to reach safety and continue the fight. Motor launch operators from other ships in the harbor began rescue operations almost immediately, their small boats weaving between burning oil slicks and falling debris to pull survivors from the water. Chief Boatswain's mate Joseph George maneuvered his launch through the chaos, his crew hauling aboard sailor after sailor from the Arizona's crew. These rescue efforts continued throughout the attack, with many boat crews making multiple trips into the danger zone. As the Arizona settled deeper into the harbor, her flag still flew defiantly from the stern. The sight of the stars and stripes waving through the smoke and flames became a symbol of American resilience that would inspire the nation in the dark days ahead. Even in death, the mighty battleship continued to serve her country, her sacrifice, galvanizing a nation that had been caught off guard but would never again be unprepared for war. While the Arizona burned, other ships throughout Pearl Harbor were mounting desperate defenses against the continuing Japanese assault. Aboard the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, Chief Quartermaster Robert Sedbury took the helm after the ship's captain was injured. The Nevada's attempt to escape the harbor became one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire battle. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the Nevada's navigator, made the controversial decision to beach the ship rather than risk her sinking in the harbor channel, which would have blocked the entrance for months. As Japanese dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the moving battleship, Thomas calmly directed the ship toward Hospital Point, where she could be grounded without blocking naval operations. The Nevada's journey down the harbor channel was a gauntlet of fire and steel. Japanese pilots, recognizing the opportunity to sink a ship in the narrow channel, focused their attacks on the slowly moving battleship. Bombs exploded all around the ship, sending geysers of water and shrapnel across her decks. Anti-aircraft gunners aboard the Nevada maintained continuous fire, their tracers streaking across the sky as they tried to bring down the attacking aircraft. At Hickam Field, Technical Sergeant William Schick had organized a makeshift defense of the airfield despite the overwhelming odds. Most of the American aircraft had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, but Schick and his men were determined to protect what remained. Using rifles and machine guns salvaged from damaged planes, they established defensive positions and began firing at low-flying Japanese aircraft. The heroism displayed during those desperate hours was not limited to military personnel. Civilians throughout Oahu rushed to help however they could. Dr. John Moorhead, chief of surgery at Tripler Army Medical Center, had been playing golf when the attack began. Still wearing his golf clothes, he raced to the hospital and began performing emergency surgery on wounded sailors and soldiers. His skilled hands saved countless lives during the chaotic hours that followed. At the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, aviation machinist's mate Finn had set up a machine gun position in the open, fully exposed to enemy fire. Despite being wounded multiple times by bomb fragments and machine gun bullets, he continued to fire at attacking Japanese aircraft. His actions that day would earn him the Medal of Honor, but more importantly, his courage inspired other sailors to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. The USS Maryland, moored beside the capsized Oklahoma, became a fortress of American resistance. Captain Daniel Callahan organized his crew into fighting units, with some men manning anti-aircraft guns while others helped rescue sailors from the water. The Maryland's guns blazed throughout the attack, and her crew shot down several Japanese aircraft, proving that American forces could fight back effectively when given the chance. In the harbor itself, small boats and launches became the lifeline for hundreds of sailors trapped in the water. Chief Boatswain's mate John Finn, not to be confused with the aviation machinist's mate of the same name, commanded a motor launch that rescued more than 100 men from the burning water. Around the Arizona, his boat made trip after trip through the oil fires and debris, each journey risking the lives of his crew to save their fellow sailors. The attack on Pearl Harbor revealed the best and worst of human nature. While the Japanese had achieved tactical surprise, the American response demonstrated the courage and determination that would ultimately win the war. Officers and enlisted men, regulars and reserves, all fought with the same desperate courage. They were fighting not just for their ships and their lives, but for their country and their way of life. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft departed, leaving behind a harbor filled with smoke and flames, the defenders of Pearl Harbor had only minutes to prepare for the second assault. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led 171 aircraft in the follow-up attack, targeting ships that had escaped serious damage in the first wave. And focusing on the naval base's infrastructure, the second wave faced a very different reception than the first. American gunners, now fully alert and manning their weapons, put up a fierce barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The sky above Pearl Harbor became a deadly lattice of tracers and exploding shells as every available gun on every ship and shore battery joined the defense. The Japanese pilots found themselves flying through a storm of steel that made their mission far more dangerous than the first attack. Lieutenant Stephen Saltzman, commanding an anti-aircraft battery at Pearl Harbor, had organized his men into an efficient fighting unit during the brief lull between attacks. When Shimazaki's aircraft appeared over the harbor, Saltzman's guns were ready. His battery claimed several Japanese aircraft during the second wave, their accurate fire forcing the enemy bombers to fly higher and reducing their bombing accuracy. Aboard the damaged but still fighting USS Pennsylvania, Admiral Husband Kimmel watched the second attack unfold from the ship's bridge. The commander of the Pacific Fleet had been at his residence when the first attack began, and he had raced to the harbor to take personal command of the defense. His presence on the Pennsylvania's bridge, calm and determined despite the chaos around him, inspired confidence in the ship's crew. The Pennsylvania, sitting in dry dock with the destroyers Cassin and Downs, presented a tempting target for the Japanese bombers. The ship's anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, their crews working with mechanical precision despite the bombs falling around them. When a direct hit set the nearby destroyers ablaze, the Pennsylvania's crew continued fighting, their guns never ceasing their defensive fire. At the Navy Yard, Chief Boatswain's mate John Crawford had organized damage control parties that moved from ship to ship, helping to fight fires and rescue wounded sailors. Crawford's teams worked throughout the attack, often under direct enemy fire, to save ships and lives. Their professional skill and courage prevented several damaged vessels from becoming total losses. The second wave also targeted the base's fuel storage tanks, which held millions of gallons of oil necessary for naval operations. Had these tanks been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have been crippled for months. However, the Japanese pilots, perhaps distracted by the intense anti-aircraft fire, failed to concentrate their attacks on these critical targets. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, responsible for the fuel depot's security, had organized his men to fight fires and prevent secondary explosions that could have devastated the entire facility. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Robert Bennett had established a first aid station near the harbor, treating wounded sailors as they were pulled from the water. Despite being under constant threat from strafing Japanese fighters, Bennett and his medical team continued their work throughout both waves of the attack. Their skilled medical care saved dozens of lives and prevented many serious injuries from becoming fatal. The USS Helm, a destroyer that had been patrolling outside the harbor entrance, raced back to join the fight during the second wave. Lieutenant Commander Carroll Hartwell brought his ship into the harbor at full speed, his guns blazing at Japanese aircraft. The Helm's dramatic entry into the battle inspired cheers from sailors on other ships and demonstrated that the American fleet was far from defeated. By the end of the second wave, the character of the battle had changed significantly. While the Japanese had achieved their primary objective of damaging the Pacific Fleet, they had also awakened a sleeping giant. The courage and determination displayed by American forces during the attack would become the foundation for the massive military effort that would ultimately defeat Japan and its allies. When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon at approximately 10 a.m., Pearl Harbor was left to count the devastating cost of the surprise attack. The silence that followed the roar of engines and explosions was almost more unsettling than the battle itself. Smoke continued to rise from burning ships, and the harbor water was covered with oil, debris, and the personal effects of sailors who would never return home. The USS Arizona lay on the bottom of the harbor, her superstructure twisted and blackened, but her stern still visible above the water. Of her crew of 1,512 men, 1,177 had been killed, including Captain Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who had been visiting the ship when the attack began. The Arizona's death toll represented more than half of all American fatalities that day nearby. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, her hull visible above the water line like the belly of a beached whale. 429 sailors had died aboard the Oklahoma, many trapped below decks when the ship rolled over after taking multiple torpedo hits. Rescue efforts to cut through the hull and reach survivors would continue for days, and the sound of men trapped inside the ship hammering on the steel plates would haunt rescuers for the rest of their lives. The human cost of the attack was staggering. 2,403 Americans had been killed, including 68 civilians. Another 1,178 had been wounded. Among the dead were men from every state in the Union, young sailors who had enlisted seeking adventure, and older career military men who had dedicated their lives to their country's service. According to records from the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, the youngest victim was Robert Scott, a Navy bandsman who was only 17 years old, while the oldest was Chief Petty Officer John Devine, who was 68. The material losses were equally devastating. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels. 188 aircraft had been destroyed, most of them caught on the ground during the initial attack. The Pacific Fleet, once the pride of the American Navy, lay in ruins in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. But even as the immediate casualties were being counted, the work of recovery and rescue continued. Commander Samuel Fuqua, the senior surviving officer aboard the Arizona, organized rescue efforts despite being wounded himself. His calm leadership in the hours after the attack saved many lives and earned him the Medal of Honor. Fuqua's actions exemplified the professionalism and courage that would characterize the American military response to the disaster. Medical personnel worked around the clock to treat the wounded. The base hospital was overwhelmed, so emergency medical stations were established in schools, churches, and even private homes throughout Honolulu. Civilian doctors and nurses volunteered their services, working alongside military medical personnel to provide care for the hundreds of wounded sailors and soldiers. The recovery of bodies from the sunken ships was a grim and dangerous task. Divers worked in the murky, oil-contaminated water to reach trapped sailors, often risking their own lives in the process. Chief gunners mate Harold Sandall supervised diving operations at the Arizona, personally entering the flooded compartments to search for survivors and recover the bodies of fallen comrades. Perhaps most remarkable was the speed with which repair work began, even before the last fires had been extinguished. Navy repair crews were assessing damage and beginning the enormous task of salvaging what could be saved. The dry dock facilities, miraculously undamaged despite being primary targets, became centers of round-the-clock activity as workers began the process of raising sunken ships and repairing damaged vessels. The psychological impact of the attack was as significant as the physical damage. Americans, secure in their belief that the vast Pacific Ocean protected them from foreign attack, suddenly realized that their homeland was vulnerable. The shock of the Pearl Harbor attack would unite the American people in a way that no political speech or propaganda campaign ever could have accomplished. The news of Pearl Harbor spread across the American mainland like wildfire, carried by radio broadcasts that interrupted regular Sunday programming. Families gathered around their radios in living rooms across the country, listening in stunned silence as reporters described the devastation in Hawaii. The attack had not only destroyed ships and killed sailors, it had shattered America's sense of invulnerability and isolation from the world's conflicts. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch at the White House when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called with the first reports of the attack. The president, who had been trying to keep America out of the war while supporting Britain and other allies, now faced the reality that the decision had been taken out of his hands. The Japanese had chosen war, and America would respond with all the force it could muster. The president immediately called his cabinet into emergency session. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and other key officials gathered in the White House as reports continued to arrive from Pearl Harbor. The scale of the disaster became clear as the day progressed. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled. Thousands of Americans were dead or wounded, and the nation was now at war whether it wanted to be or not. Roosevelt spent the evening of December 7th working on the speech he would deliver to Congress the next day. The president, one of the great orators of his generation, understood that his words would not only ask for a declaration of war, but would also help unite the American people behind the war effort. He wrote and rewrote the speech, searching for the right tone and the right words to capture the nation's shock and determination. Across the country, Americans were already responding to the attack with a mixture of grief, anger, and determination. In New York City, Times Square filled with crowds reading the news bulletins posted on the electronic signs. The mood was somber but resolute. People understood that their country had been attacked and that war was now inevitable. Military recruiting stations across the nation were overwhelmed with volunteers. Even before the formal declaration of war, young men who had been reluctant to get involved in what they saw as a European conflict now lined up for hours to enlist. The attack on Pearl Harbor had made the war personal for every American, and they were ready to fight back. In factories and shipyards, workers who had been producing materials for Britain and other allies under the Lend-Lease program now knew that their work was directly supporting their own country's war effort. Production schedules were accelerated, and many facilities began operating around the clock to meet the enormous demands that would come with America's entry into the war. The attack also had immediate effects on Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Fear and suspicion, fueled by the shock of Pearl Harbor, led to increased surveillance and eventual internment of thousands of loyal American citizens, whose only crime was their ancestry. This shameful chapter in American history would later be recognized as a grave injustice. But in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, fear often overcame reason. On December 8th, President Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress to deliver what would become known as the Day of Infamy speech. The president's words were broadcast live across the nation, and millions of Americans listened as he described the attack and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The speech was brief but powerful, capturing the nation's mood and setting the stage for America's full participation in World War II. The congressional response was overwhelming. The House of Representatives voted 388 to 1 to declare war on Japan. With only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissenting, the Senate vote was unanimous. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was officially at war for the first time since 1917. The transformation of American society had begun. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended the age of American isolationism and begun the process that would make the United States the world's dominant military and economic power. The grief and shock of December 7th would be transformed into the unstoppable resolve that would ultimately win the war. The months following Pearl Harbor witnessed the most remarkable transformation in American history. The nation that had been reluctant to enter the war became the arsenal of democracy, producing ships, planes, and weapons at a rate that astonished both allies and enemies. The grief and anger generated by the attack on Pearl Harbor became the driving force behind an unprecedented mobilization of American industrial and military might. Within Pearl Harbor itself, the work of recovery and rebuilding began immediately. The USS Nevada, which had been beached during the attack, was refloated and repaired. By October 1942, she was back in service, her guns blazing at Japanese positions in the Aleutian Islands. The Nevada's return to combat symbolized America's determination to rise from the ashes of December 7th. The USS California and USS West Virginia, both sunk in the attack, were raised from the harbor bottom and completely rebuilt. The California returned to service in January 1944, while the West Virginia was recommissioned in September 1943. These resurrections of seemingly destroyed battleships demonstrated American engineering skill and the nation's refusal to accept defeat. Even more remarkable was the speed with which new ships were built to replace those lost at Pearl Harbor. American shipyards, employing techniques of mass production pioneered in the automobile industry, began turning out vessels at an unprecedented rate. The Kaiser shipyards in California could build a Liberty ship in just 4 days, while aircraft carriers that had once taken years to construct were being completed in months. The human cost of Pearl Harbor was never forgotten. The USS Arizona, too badly damaged to be raised, became a memorial to the men who died there. The ship's outline, visible beneath the clear Hawaiian water, served as a constant reminder of the price of unpreparedness. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel tanks, and local residents call these drops the tears of the Arizona. Many of the survivors of Pearl Harbor went on to distinguished service in the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced Admiral Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet, led the Navy's drive across the Pacific. His forces, rebuilt and reinforced after Pearl Harbor, would eventually defeat the Japanese Navy in battles like Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Light Gulf. The attack also transformed American intelligence capabilities. The failure to anticipate the Pearl Harbor attack led to massive reforms in intelligence gathering and analysis. New agencies were created, communication systems were improved, and the United States developed the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world. Never again would America be caught as unprepared as it had been on December 7th. The industrial mobilization triggered by Pearl Harbor lasted long after the war ended. The factories that had produced tanks and aircraft were converted to make automobiles and consumer goods, fueling the post-war economic boom. The technological innovations developed during the war, from radar to jet engines to nuclear power, revolutionized American society and established the United States as the world's technological leader. The veterans of Pearl Harbor carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many returned to Hawaii for anniversary commemorations, standing on the deck of the USS Arizona Memorial and remembering their fallen comrades. Their stories, preserved in oral histories and memoirs, ensured that the lessons of Pearl Harbor would not be forgotten by future generations. The attack on Pearl Harbor had indeed transformed American grief into unstoppable resolve. The nation that had been attacked while at peace became the arsenal that supplied the forces of freedom around the world. The ships that had been sunk in the harbor were raised and repaired. returning to sink Japanese vessels in battles across the Pacific. The men who had died in the attack were honored by the courage of those who survived and by the ultimate victory their sacrifice had made possible. The USS Missouri, the battleship on which Japan would surrender on September 2, 1945, was moored just yards from the sunken Arizona. The proximity of these two ships, one representing the beginning of America's involvement in the war and the other its triumphant conclusion, perfectly symbolized the transformation that had taken place. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor had risen the unstoppable force that would liberate the world from tyranny and establish America as the leader of the free world. The legacy of Pearl Harbor extends far beyond military history. It demonstrated that free peoples, when threatened, could mobilize resources and determination that totalitarian regimes could never match. The attack that was meant to cripple America instead awakened its strength, and the grief of December 7th became the foundation for victory in the greatest war in human history.